All right, so welcome back to week 3 of the historical books on Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And once again, we're going to be looking at how the fact that these historical books are representing history, but they're representing history from a historian's point of view. So, whoever the final editor of Joshua was, which is what we're going to focus on this week, he has something he wants to teach us about the events that happened during the time of Joshua that is that's related to the actual history that happened, but unrelated to how that might have been told from different various perspectives. All right, so in this week, once again, it's going to be the second part of us looking at the book of Joshua. And we're just going to focus on three main sections here because, once again, in this course, we won't be able to cover everything in any of these books except for, we could cover everything in the book of Ruth because it's the smallest of all of them. But for Joshua and Judges, we won't be able to cover everything. So instead, we're just going to focus on sections, and then we're going to focus on important parts of those sections. So the first part we're going to focus on is the defeat at Ai and how that fits into the structure of Joshua, especially everything that has come before it. Then we're going to talk about the covenant at Mount Elba, just very briefly about what's kind of happening there and what the goals of that section is. And then we're going to talk about the Gibeonites' deception and look at some aspects of interpretation that affect those particular passages. So we'll jump into that now. So one of the very first things that Harris is going to point out in this section of Joshua is that victory is often a prelude to disaster in the Bible. And I'm going to show you this in the structure of the Pentateuch, but often you'll have some sort of victory that happens and then right after a failure that will take place. Now, one of the things that we want to acknowledge from that is that's just kind of the nature of life. We'll talk about this even more when we get to the time of Judges, is that in Judges, you're going to have this oppression that has happened, and then this 20 to 40 years of peace that comes after that oppression is lifted, and then the cycle kind of repeats itself. So that also happens within somewhat of the structure of the biblical narratives, which is why it's also important to read them in the context in which they are given to us. So then he's going to go on to give these other examples beyond the ones I'm going to show you here in a minute. He's going to talk about the joy of the Song of Moses after the Exodus has hardly died down before the people complain. So you can read in Exodus 14 where the Exodus event happens, then Exodus 15, the song of deliverance, and then literally right after the song has happened, the people are complaining about no longer being in Egypt. And then it's going to have, the section where he says Moses faces a golden calf upon coming down from the mountain after receiving the commandments of the covenant. So once again, right after he's gone up to meet with the Lord, as the people requested him to do, and in a sense gotten the success where you've gotten the commandments from God himself about how you need to live. So you don't have to question, what does God want us to do? Well, here are the commandments of exactly how God would want you to live. And they're going to be sinning the whole time, worshiping a golden calf, which we talked about some in the Pentateuch class, and we would discuss some more, in other courses beyond this one. So one example of this outside of the book of Joshua is just found in Exodus, and once again, this is just a short section of this sort of analysis that happens. But pretty much throughout the Pentateuch, in various locations, you get a narrative and then a law kind of explaining how God responded to the people in the narrative. So they've had some sort of failure, then a law is given. Then you get another narrative and more laws are given. So let me just parse this out a little further. So like in Exodus 19, it's pretty much God calling the people, telling them to come up to the mountain when they're going to meet with God when they hear the trumpet sound, and then they end up freaking out when they hear the trumpet sounding. So then God gives them the law in Exodus 20, the 10 commandments, or the Decalogue as it's called. And then you get another narrative. Now I want to show you how these two narratives connect. So if you go to Exodus chapter 19, in verse 18, it's going to say, Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kindling, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. And then after this, Moses goes up, and you're told that the Lord tells Moses to go down and talk to the people and tell the people not to come up the mountain. And it's somewhat curious as to why this is the case. Like what's happening here that is causing Moses to have to tell the people not to come up the mountain. Well, then if you go to once again, the narrative intentionally skips that part. If you go to Exodus chapter 20, verse 18, it's going to tell you, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood afar off and said to Moses, you speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, and that you may not sin. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So when God then, back in chapter 19, tells Moses, well, go down and warn the people lest they break through to the Lord to look, and many of them perish. Well, this is after they've already had this opportunity to go forward with Moses as well, and they have chosen not to. But once again, those two narratives have been intentionally separated by this law that's given in Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17. So there's intentionality to how the text is structured, is what I'm trying to emphasize here. So the whole point of this in the structure of Joshua is that you've had this success that has just come before the people. That has taken place in Joshua chapter 6. You've defeated Jericho, this stronghold that you could not have just kind of rushed through the city, where you had to march around it, and God delivered the city into your hands, potentially on the Sabbath day, like we talked about in the other lecture. And so now in chapter 7, you've got that same sort of thing. You've got this narrative and not really a law, but the sort of failure that's coming following that same sort of pattern, where after the people have had a failure, there's this sort of commandment or this change or something like that that's going to happen amongst the people of God. And this is where we get, in a sense, a lament that comes from Joshua, in the same way that we had this sort of curse that came from Joshua at the end of chapter 6, where he gave this sort of curse in the sense of trying to encourage people not to rebuild on this foundation, but to rebuild on a stronger foundation, on the foundation that God would have them not rebuilding this city of sinful people and people who are rebelling against God, which fits once again in the context of the bigger picture of what's happening in the Old Testament. Now you get the sort of lament that happens, and Harris is going to point out that this lament follows the same pattern as what is normally found in lament psalms, but he doesn't detail that for you, so I'm just going to show you all of the details of that in Joshua 7. And so if you study the complaint psalms, which are also known as the lament psalms, and this structure comes from Herman Gunkel's analysis of the Psalter, you'll see that there is a basic structure to what's called a complaint psalm or a lament psalm. So first, you're always going to have this vocative that calls God's name, and then you're going to have what Gunkel calls the main parts, where you're going to have this complaint over misfortune, a petition to God, and a message of self-reproach, or a call for Yahweh to intervene, and then a conclusion. And then if you parallel Joshua to this structure, you're going to see that Joshua has all of the same parts except for the conclusion. So you got this vocative, alas, O Lord, calling upon God's name. Then you have the main parts, so this complaint over misfortune. You're going to say, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all? To give us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? Would that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan. So his complaint, that it would have been better for them to have stayed on the other side of the Jordan. And then this sort of petition to God. O Lord, what can I say when Israel has turned their backs before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it and will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. So this sort of petition of okay, oh Lord, this is what's happening. Israel is not doing their part. We need something bad here is going to happen to us. And the implication is this: we don't want this bad thing to happen. And who can do something? Okay, God himself, which is why you get this third section calling on God to intervene. And what will you do for your great name? Knowing that God's name is God's greatest honor, that his reputation is extremely important to him, that he is not going to just be giving his name out to anyone. That's part of why, once again, in the Ten Commandments, we are not to use the Lord's name in vain. We are not to soil his reputation for our own gain or put any less weight upon God's greatness than is worthy of who he is. And so you get those three main parts. And then you would want this sort of conclusion to it, which is the normal structure, where you get this sort of plea that's similar to the beginning. But instead, as Harris is going to point out, God just kind of transitions and doesn't let him sort of finish this lament. Instead, God just comes in and says, "Get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their belongings." So God's point is, in a sense, I'm not really going to listen to this lament because it's not a valid lament like you might also find in the Psalter. All right, so now that we have finished our conversation about kind of the defeat at Ai and how that kind of relates to this idea that you have narratives and then some sort of failure that comes after, especially after a success, describing what the people have to kind of go through. We're now going to talk about the covenant that was reestablished at Mount Ebal and just talk a little bit about the aspect of reading of the law that takes place there. All right, so once again, there's a lot that goes on in this chapter, but I want to bring your attention directly to the law here. So you've got the book of the law of Moses being written here, and then a precise citation of something written in the law of Moses. You then have this idea of a copy of the law being written by Joshua for all of the people. Then you have them kind of going through this, and then a citation of as Moses had kind of commanded them. And then you have these verses here where he actually reads all of the words of the law, the blessing and the curses. And Joshua, once again, read this. There was not a word that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all of Israel. So this huge emphasis on the law of Moses being there, which is also known as the Pentateuch. And the idea being that Joshua does have a physical copy of it. And this kind of also gives evidence to the tradition of Joshua being the one who helped to finalize the law of Moses after Moses had died. So that's the aspect of this that we're going to focus on a little bit more in a second. And so this passage here in Joshua chapter 8, verses 34 through 35 has a lot of parallels to what's going on here in Deuteronomy 31, verses 9 through 13. And specifically, it kind of points out here that when Israel gets to the place in which the God shall choose, which also comes up in Joshua here in a moment. And there's this aspect here that a lot of people are going to assume this is Jerusalem, but it's not specifically specified exactly where it is. But the idea is when that happens, then the law was supposed to be read to all of Israel in their hearing, and just like it says here, to the women, children, and the strangers. And then you have the same thing here, women, children, and the strangers, the entire law. There was not a word of the law of Moses commanded that was not read before the entire congregation. So the idea here being is that Joshua is now putting into practice this, even though they haven't completely taken over the land and they haven't celebrated the festival here. Joshua is in a sense beginning this sort of practice, in a sense, to renew Israel after this failure that has taken place so that they can kind of move forward into success. It's almost like him foreshadowing that this is going to be accomplished by him making sure to put these practice into place early on in Israel's conquest of the land. All right, so now we're going to end off with just talking about the Gibeonites' deception, but I want to put that in context very quickly. So you've had them come into the land, they've taken Jericho, then they've had this defeat, and they've had to kind of restore their relationship to God and the covenant, and Joshua trying to kind of foreshadow this sense of we're now going to do things the way that God wants us to by projecting the practice of reading scripture to all of the people that should not have happened until after the land kind of was established. When Joshua kind of says, let's go ahead and put this into practice as if this has already kind of come about. And then the very next thing that's going to happen is the Gibeonites are going to show up and try to trick them and pretty much succeed in tricking them into thinking that they don't belong to the people of the land who are supposed to be annihilated, because they're going to respond in a sense as if the people of God that Joshua is leading already have the rights to the promised land. So I'm just going to highlight some important verses here in Joshua chapter 9. So the first thing here is in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 to 11. It says that if you're fighting cities that are far off, the first thing you should do is draw near to the city and offer it terms of peace. And if they respond to those terms of peace, then it shall be found that all the people in there should be pretty much put into forced labor and should become servants to Israel. And the idea here would be that after the nation of Israel be established, it would extend, in a sense, God's kingdom to the end of the world. And this forced labor would not be a sense of harsh sort of slavery. It would be sort of the hard work and the building of buildings and things like that. But these people would all still be able to eat and live lives. It would just be now their work would not be to do the things that they wanted to do. It would be doing the things that are going to help to build the kingdom of Israel, which would have incorporated to the kingdom of God if the king and the people of Israel were living holy as God had commanded them. So notice once again at the beginning of chapter 9 here that the very first thing the Gideonites are going to do is they're going to show up and say that we are your servants, that they've come from a foreign land, and we are your servants there in chapter 9, verse 8. So they're in a sense trying to get this to apply to them. So then you get verses 9 through 10, and they're gonna say to Joshua, they've come from a very distant land, your servants, because the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, which once again Joshua was lamenting. That the Amorites why didn't they just destroy us before we were able to cross over to the Jordan? To Shihon and the king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. Now, the point here, and Harris does a very good job of pointing this out, is they're not recounting the destruction of Jericho and the destruction of Ai. They're just pointing out the events that happened before Israel crossed over the Jordan, which would have only been events that you would have known had you traveled to come into the land from outside of the land. So that's a part of their deception. But the key here also, and this is one of the things I try to point out when it comes to the idea of holy war, is that just like the Gibeonites understand here that they do not need to fight the people of God, that they're already God's servants, and they want to instead be treated like people who were not already in the land, but people who are from outside of the land. And the people in the land, like it says in Genesis, are already being judged by God because they had already ruined the land that God had given them. Is the idea there? You can assume that that's the case. And so while they're here in the land, they realize, and they've already heard, that God is now bringing more people in to take over the land to replace them. And now they've got to make a choice. Do they leave the land, which I'm sure would have been an option, and God probably would have spared them? Do they actually fight Israel, which once again would have been an option, but it's very unlikely that they would have succeeded, except for when the people sinned, like in the case of Ai? Or do they just continue to try to find a way to live in the land, but do this in submission to Israel, understanding that God is the one who has promoted them to the position of power that they're in, and they choose to go that route? And so then once again, you can go back to Deuteronomy, and it says, okay, so if they're going to have some people, who are from outside of the land and come into the land, some of them are going to be ones who chop your wood and who draw your water. And that ends up being the compromise that's made here in Joshua 9:23, that Joshua says, okay, you're cursed. And this is what you're going to do. You're going to be our servants, and you're going to be cutters of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. And for them, similar to what says in the Psalms, if they had some genuine belief, that in a sense understanding that it's better to be in the house of God one day in his courts than 1,000 elsewhere, they would have rather been Israel's servants than to have either fled the land or to try to fight for their own land realizing that Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is the God of the universe, and once he has set something into motion, there is no way for them to deny it. And once again, they are hearing this through the reports, like it says, once again, there in the middle of this page in Joshua 9, verses 9 through 10, of what God had already done. And in Egypt, realizing that God is going to bring this about, and there is no point in fighting this. And so then the story ends with saying, okay, Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and jars of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day. And I'll pause there really quickly. So the to this day is going to be at the time that the book of Joshua was written. I remember being a kid myself and thinking, okay, to this day, even today, I could go and see that. No, to this day is going to be the time that the text was written. And this can lead you to assume that this is probably much later in the history of Israel, especially with the next statement here, where it's going to say, in the place that he shall choose, which is what a lot of people are going to view it as a veiled reference to Jerusalem. And if that's true, though that's not really the way that I particularly read this, then this is going to say that they continued to serve the Israelites until the building of the first temple in around 960 or so, when Solomon built that temple, instead of to this day being sometime before the building of the temple or the second temple or whatever the case may be. So it does depend on how you read the in the place that he shall choose and the idea of to this day, but to this day is for sure going to be at the very time in which the book of Joshua was finalized and written down. The Gibeonites were still serving Israel.